Thank you all for joining today. Just one quick reminder before we get started that you shouldn't take photos or screen grabs of slides without the speaker's present or permission. And beyond that, I don't want to give a lengthy preamble and take time away from Amy, but I'll just point out that all of the presentations in this session are designed to highlight just the variety of different uses of FIA data and monitoring, as well as some ways to make use of FIA data more efficient. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Amy Nathanson. And Amy is the Regional Vegetation Ecologist with the Forest Service Southern Region.
Thanks. So my name is Amy Nathanson, and I am the Regional Vegetation Ecologist for the Southern Region, Region 8. And I'm going to talk to you about using FIA for forest monitoring in the Southern Region. So when we talk about monitoring, we usually want to know how much we have, either now or in the past, and how it has changed or is changing. However, we would also like to know the condition of the thing that we're looking at. And I'm going to talk about that in the context of some of the priorities of Region 8. And just to call out the picture, this is a picture of Jim Caldwell, the public affairs officer on the Kisatchie National Forest. He's given a little longleaf pine sapling a little wiggle. We're going to talk about longleaf pine first, and then we're going to come back to the Kisatchie National Forest. So one of our regional priorities is restoring longleaf pine, which now encompasses a fraction of its former extent. A former regional forester set a challenge of restoring 1 million acres of longleaf pine on Forest Service lands. So the question is, how much longleaf is there on Forest Service lands? And there are a couple of data sets that can be used to answer that question. The first data set I'm going to talk about is FSVEG, which is the Forest Service database of record. Some of the limitations on FSVEG is that there are no longer the personnel required to visit all of the compartments on the 10-year rotation interval. And compartments are usually visited before management occurs, so the conditions may change from what was recorded in this database. Also, an area may have longleaf pine in it, but not be classified as a longleaf pine forest type. It also doesn't account for areas that should be longleaf but were type converted to some other forest type, often loblolly pine. And also, this information is only collected on Forest Service lands. So another data source that we can use is FIA. Now, there are some limitations in FIA as well. A single point usually represents thousands of acres, and these calls are also a field call for forest type. It is, however, a nationwide data set that covers all lands. But neither of the estimates that I'm showing here get at condition. So to get at estimates of extent and condition, we used indicators that were developed in conjunction with NatureServe. This guide pictured here provides a set of key characteristics to evaluate open pine systems across the southern region. The goal was to measure open pine wildlife habitat and ecological health based on peer-reviewed literature, original research, and expert input with easy-to-use, rapid assessment protocols. So note that these indicators were intended for a field-based inventory. What we did was we translated NatureServe's metrics into those that could be addressed by FIA data. So for example, these canopy metrics, these are all available in FIA. FIA is very good at collecting this kind of information. The understory and midstory data, FIA just doesn't collect a lot of that information. So some of those metrics we couldn't use for our estimates. And then some metrics weren't explicitly collected by FIA, but we could use them to estimate some of the metrics of interest. And then once we made that translation, we contracted with a former FIA programmer to develop queries and calculate estimates for longleaf. So with that information, we get an estimate of extent and condition of longleaf. And since we're using FIA data, we were able to do this on Forest Service and non-Forest Service lands. Now, the analysis isn't perfect. Some plots might have had longleaf, but they weren't truly longleaf stands. They simply had a longleaf pine component. Some plots also it weren't accounted for because they were type converted again to some other stand. So they should have been longleaf pine, but they were some other forest type. So the analysis wasn't perfect, but it is a good start. And with this information, we can answer some questions. We can estimate where it is present and in what condition. We can also provide confident estimates, though that wasn't done for this particular analysis. It is something that is possible. And we can estimate change over time. And we can do it in terms of area and condition because the FIA plots are revisited on a regular basis. So we can look at whether areas that are good are expanding, and if areas that are in poor condition or in need of restoration are decreasing. So putting this in the context of the 2012 planning rule, the planning rule talks about maintaining and restoring ecosystem integrity, including structure, function, composition, and connectivity. Acres of forest type by themselves don't get at that, but condition does. Now, there are some questions that we can't answer using FIA data. It doesn't say where longleaf should or should not be present, and it doesn't contain all of the metrics to completely evaluate ecosystem integrity, though it does get at some of them. It doesn't tell managers where to conduct restoration activities. The analysis was non-spatial, but it can provide insight in where to look. And it can be combined with other data sets to try and provide more robust answers in terms of where we should be doing active management for ecosystem restoration. I'd like to take just a moment and put in a plug for FIA Data Mart. And I'm sure that most people know about this feature, but when we did the original analysis, we had to download data for each of the 13 states encompassed in the southern region, which also includes Puerto Rico. We had to download each of those data sets separately. It was very challenging to conduct the analysis on all these separate data sets and to keep them organized. This updated data mart means that you can download the entire database all at once. And then you have a static record. So if you update your analysis, you can compare apples to apples, the original versus updated analyses results. And it is so much easier than the old version. So just download yours today. Getting back to the Kisatchie, in the August of 2024, each region hosted a field meeting to highlight an aspect of old growth. And the southern region's field meeting was on the Kisatchie National Forest, which is pictured here. And it showcased longleaf pine stands. These stands often have a dense understory of sweet gum in areas that have missed prescribed burns, and the region emphasized the need for active management to maintain these systems. Unlike the grasses and forbs you see in my background picture, which is also a longleaf stand on the Francis Marion, there can often be a dense and very fast-growing understory of hardwood tree species on the Kisatchie. So these are the Forest Service estimates for the old growth and mature inventory, which was completed as part of Executive Order 14072. The southern region does not have a lot of old growth, though it does have a lot of mature forest based on the inventory. This is due in large part to the land use history of the region. Executive Order 14072 required the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management to define, identify, and complete an inventory of old growth and mature forests on federal lands, and then to analyze the threats to mature and old growth. The inventory was generally based on age, large trees, snags, basal area, and a few other things. And the inventory was done using FIA data, so there was limited information on the understory vegetation, which we know is important for assessing the ecological integrity of old growth systems. And then just to highlight the picture that we have here, in case you can't read it, the text on the photograph at the right references 1949 prices. So this is a picture of an older pine stand in the southern region. In the threats analysis report for Executive Order 14072, one of the threats that was highlighted was lack of fire. And also note that some of the threats to old growth systems in the southern region were mesification due to lack of fire. Mesification is the ingrowth of shade-tolerant species that can change the disturbance regimes of an ecosystem. we took a closer look at the inventory, and it revealed some interesting insights about old growth. I'm going to use a southern oak example, but I wanted to highlight this photograph on the left, which is a picture of an oak history stand taken near Asheville, North Carolina. Many of the larger trees are chestnut oak, and then the majority of the mid-story is made up of red maple, which is a shade-intolerant hardwood species. So this is an example of two plots directly from the old growth inventory in the southern region on the same forest. They're two old growth hickory forest type plots. And both of these were classified as old growth based on the Region 8 old growth criteria. And you can see that it was likely due in large part to the presence of large oaks, though there were obviously other criteria that classified this as an old growth system. But what I want to highlight here is the extremely high density of very small diameter red maple, which is an indicator of mesification. And looks like this particular plot probably missed a couple of fire disturbance intervals. Both plots were classified as old growth due to the elements that they do have. Both have large old trees, but the plots were not excluded from old growth if they had potentially undesirable conditions such as a high density of small diameter shade intolerant trees, which would be indicative of fire suppression. We haven't done extensive work in classifying condition in old growth forests, though this is something that we've been discussing as a region and also, I think, on a national level to some extent. Though we think that there's a lot of potential in FIA to better understand condition of various ecosystems, whether they're longleaf pine, whether they're shortleaf pine, whether they're oak systems or old growth. We feel that FIA is definitely a piece of the puzzle for monitoring extent and condition over time, though more localized decisions may need to be informed by other data sets. FIA can't answer all of the questions or cover all of the aspects of a fully functioning ecosystem, but it can get at a lot of them. And we think that there is a lot of potential for incorporating FIA further into NFS monitoring. That is all I have, and Katie hasn't popped up yet, so I don't think I'm over time.
No, you're not. And actually, we've got 2 minutes left. So are there any questions for Amy? I've got one. Amy, how frequently do you think you'll be repeating this analysis to update those results?
So we did this analysis by utilizing a contractor who has expertise in FIA data. We would like to implement them, do some changes, especially with this. I'm sure everybody knows about it, but I can't emphasize enough how wonderful it is to be able to download all of FIA in one chunk. And now it's mine. I have all the data. So we will need to rewrite the code to implement it in this new way. And once we're doing that, I don't really have a plan for how often we would redo it. It would have to be some meaningful sum, like 5 years or 10 years, to be able to see change. I think more what we'd like to do is see this implemented under other ecosystems looking at condition, like the shortleaf pine, which has similar metrics now to the longleaf pine ecosystems. The big three in the southern region are probably longleaf pine, shortleaf pine, and oak restoration, all of very high interest to us and very, yes, Ray Sheffield. Thank you for calling him out. He is our hero.
Awesome. Well, you also managed to answer the question in the chat too. So well done.
Well, Jeff Turner was calling me out. Ray Sheffield was a great asset for us.
All right. Well, thanks, Amy. And next up, we have Ashley Prentice, who's a forest carbon specialist with the Colorado State Forest Service.
All right. Thank you. Let me share my screen. Is that up there? Can you guys see it?
Yeah, looks good.
Cool. Great. So I am with the Colorado State Forest Service. I'm a forest carbon specialist, and I'm going to be talking about a section of a broader assessment. It's called the Colorado Biomass Assessment, and one section of that characterizes and quantifies forest biomass in Colorado. So some of the motivation behind this project, Colorado's 2020 wildfire season had multiple record-breaking wildfires with devastating impacts to several communities. And these events underscored the urgent need for new and innovative wildfire mitigation strategies. So in response, in 2021, the Colorado legislature passed a House bill that focused on increasing biomass utilization across the state. And a key piece to this effort involved updating a GTR that was published in 2001 by Dennis Lynch and Kurt Mackes called Wood Use in Colorado at the Turn of the 21st Century. It hasn't been updated until now. So this update, again, we're calling it the Colorado Biomass Assessment, provides a comprehensive update on woody biomass in the state. It addresses biomass applications, supply chain dynamics, and utilization potential. And it quantifies resources, creating a scientific foundation for decision making. And it also serves as a model for similar efforts in other states. So again, this presentation will just focus on the section that quantifies resources. And I'll say that this analysis really broadly assesses the feasibility of introducing new products and markets based on potential biomass supply. So it's really looking at statewide estimates and then regional estimates. So the objectives of this are, one, to update and quantify Colorado's woody biomass inventory, to provide a scientific foundation for management and policy decisions, to explore biomass utilization potential to support forest industry development, and then again to serve as a model framework for other states. So early into this process, we decided to use FIA data as the foundation for this assessment. And since the primary goal of this initiative is to support existing and emerging wood markets, it made sense to focus on volume variables. So although it's the Colorado Biomass Assessment, we are talking about volume for this section. And that was because volume is measured in CCF, which is a standard industry unit. So it just made sense to look at volume. And we took a close look at the different volume variables that are available in the FIA database, and we selected 5 different volume variables to be able to classify materials into categories that are relevant to existing or emerging industries. So it's broken out by timber species versus woodland species, and then we used the gross central stem, which includes all usable and defective portions, and then the gross non-merchantable top that became available with the NSVB update, and then the net central stem volume, which excludes coal and focuses on the usable portion of the stem, and then the net sawlog portion, or the usable portion that meets sawlog specifications. And then for woodland species, we used the total stem volume, which would include wood, bark, and branches with coal. And so the diagram there illustrates the different components of a tree that are reflected in these different variables that we chose from the base to the non-merchantable top. And then I'll go into a little detail about how we characterized material before I go into how it was quantified. And the first category that I'll talk about is what we're calling other log volume. So we started with the gross volume and then subtracted the saw timber volume, focusing on the net values that exclude defect and coal. And so doing that, we were able to isolate the smaller diameter materials, so trees that are between 5 and 9 inches for softwood timber species. And so examples of what this can be used for is kind of traditional things like post and pole and firewood, but also emerging industries like mass timber in Colorado. And then the next category is what we're calling non-log volume. So this represents the material that remains when you subtract the saw timber volume and the other log volume from the gross amount, but including coal and defect. So for softwood timber species, this would be any remaining wood material that's greater than 5 inches. that wouldn't meet the criteria for saw log or other logs. It includes a lot of the woodland species that we have. And then this category would be for helping a wide range of uses that are more non-traditional industries, like biochar and bio-oil and wood chips and animal bedding and things that we're starting to see interest in Colorado. And then, of course, these industries aren't just limited to those two categories. Like, they can utilize material from multiple categories. The Mass Timber Initiative in Colorado isn't just going to be using the small diameter material. It'll be using larger saw timber volume as well. And then for the last category, we assess salvageable volume. So dead material with a tree class code that we identified as hard salvageable material. So it has less than 67% of the volume is coal. And this includes all different species types, and it can be used for a wide variety of industries like biochar and bioenergy. And so the way that we were able to quantify the material within each of those categories, we used the Fiesta package in R, and we applied the standard Green Book functions for that. FIA data in Colorado is measured every 10 years. So we use the most recent panel from 2010 to 2019, but it'll soon be updated with the recent data release for 2012 to 2021. And then our estimates are calculated at the individual county level, but we also were able, from using the Green Book functions, to aggregate them into the 4 different Colorado State Forest Service regions, which are made up of groups of counties, and then also to the state level. And so we focused on forested counties, which meant much of the eastern half of the state is excluded. We filtered for non-reserved land to be able to remove areas like wilderness areas and national park areas, but we made an exception for state lands. FIA designates state lands as reserved, but many of these areas have active management plans in Colorado that do include timber harvesting. So we included state lands for that. And then through using Fiesta, we were able to summarize each volume category from the previous slide across each county, and then broken out by ownership groups and then by species groups. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about our results, but I want to just provide an overview of the different scales and the different categories that we use to summarize the data. So these 2 graphs show just statewide volume estimates of the 3 different categories. The other log material, so again, like small diameter material, is in purple. The non-log material, a lot of woodlands, is in green, and then salvageable material is in orange. And we broke out the state totals by species group on the left. So there's 10 different species groups in Colorado, and then by ownership groups with 4 different ownership groups in Colorado. And then this is where the results really start to get interesting. We looked at each volume category by county and mapped it. So counties in the blue colors are, they represent higher volumes, and then the yellows and greens represent lower volumes. So you can start to see by looking at the estimates in this visual way that how it can start to inform stakeholders about where potential supply exists to support certain industries, or where there might not be a sufficient supply in certain areas, or also where there's a high supply, but it is too far away from existing processing sites. And so it generally, the results follow what we would expect on species distribution in the state, but also the impacts of recent disturbances are also reflected in these results. So, for example, the other log material, again, smaller diameter volume, is high in Gunnison and Saguache counties in the southwest part of the state. Those areas have a lot of spruce and pine forests. And then western counties near the border for non-log material, those counties are mostly dominated by woodland species, so we see that start to come out. And then for salvageable material, the northern counties, we see high amounts of that material that really reflects the impacts of mostly mountain pine beetle and other insect and disease outbreaks. And so this is just one way to look at the data, but we also provide tables and tabular data. So for each county, it's broken out by forest type and ownership, so different stakeholders can really start to paint a picture of what could be a sustainable business idea or not. And then our assessment provides really broad accounting of biomass availability across different scales and categories, but this really just scratches the surface because these estimates are so broad. There's a lot of different areas we could pursue for further research, especially using Fiesta. We could use Fiesta to create more detailed estimates with incorporating custom size classes or diameters or certain product specifications. And we could also use FIA or Fiesta, the Fiesta package to analyze specific disturbance impacts on biomass availability in certain areas. And then something we're talking about right now is expanding the analysis to incorporate spatial data tools to assess more of the on-the-ground feasibility with slope and topography and the road access and all the other factors at play, and more of a specific idea of the distance to mills. And then I want to highlight that Fiesta made all of this work possible due to its really efficient data wrangling ability. I can't emphasize that enough. We couldn't have done this without Fiesta. And it's reproducible, so we can rerun this into the future as needed. And there's just so much flexibility within this package to pull in existing FIA variables to help inform different questions. So a huge shout out to Fiesta. And then some of the bigger takeaways for this, again, this work provides really just the foundation for identifying market opportunities. It can guide management plans, it can support local rural economies and industries, creating new jobs, it can reduce management and treatment costs, but really where some of these findings shine is that it can help shape policies in Colorado to grow Colorado's forest products industry. And so part of the Colorado Biomass Assessment, a different section of it found that in 2022, Colorado sourced about 88% of its wood from outside the state. So we're really dependent on imported wood in Colorado, and expanding our in-state capacity is really critical as we meet a lot of the challenges that we face. So supporting innovative markets can not only reduce the reliance on imports, but it can also offset the high management costs. And then the last thing is that these efforts also have implications for carbon storage. So we're wrapping up our first Colorado forest carbon inventory that quantifies forest ecosystem carbon, but also harvested wood product carbon. So expanding the industry here in Colorado provides a lot of opportunities for continued carbon storage in wood products. And then some of the examples of where we're already using some of these results is with the Colorado Mass Timber Initiative, informing a study on the plugging of oil and gas wells with biochar, and then helping with several state level woody biomass assessments. And I might be out of time, but want to acknowledge and thank everybody on this screen, especially Tracy Frasino with RMRS for her assistance with the Fiesta package and getting to this point with our results. So thank you.
Awesome. You are right on time, but we don't have any time left for questions. So we'll move right on to our next presenter, who is Kristen Pelz. And Kristen is the FIA analysis team leader for Rocky Mountain Research Station, FIA.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Kristen Pelz, as Katie introduced me, and I am stationed here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'm going to talk about some pilot work I'm working on, along with some others in my neck of the woods, which is northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. I'm really grateful to the presentations before because they were awesome and they also set the stage. And I think that also Erin's later will add to this, but I think it'll help give some context. So let's see, one second. We're doing some work to monitor for collaborative forest landscape restoration projects here using our data and also the Fiesta tool. And next slide. None of this would be possible without these people, and I wanted to make sure and say this right up front. Like Ashley, I work closely with Tracy using Fiesta, and also Nathan Dolphin, who is one of our crew members who has done amazing work during the winter on coding and creating automated reports. Tracy and Nathan really did a huge amount of this work over the last couple years, and I'm really grateful to them. Cheryl Gunn is a collaborator at the San Juan National Forest in Durango, Colorado, and she's on the Southwest Colorado CFLR Science and Monitoring team. And that whole group has also been instrumental in this. And then finally, I wanted to make sure to mention none of this would be possible without our amazing field crews and all the staff that wrangle our data and get it into usable format. So I wanted to say thank you to them. This is a picture of some of our crew, Alyssa Cohen and Erin Miller, doing some QC work out in the field. So thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to give an overview about the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program and its monitoring needs, particularly some ongoing pilot work that we're developing, and then looking forward. So some of you may be familiar with the CFLR program, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit for those that aren't. Normally, I spend this time talking about FIA data, but I don't think I need to do that in this group. So the CFLR program is a Forest Service program that was established in 2009 by Congress. It was established to encourage collaborative, science-based restoration of forested landscapes, and really across all ownerships, not just federal ownerships, even though it is a Forest Service program. So to apply for these, you need to have a collaborative group with common restoration objectives, and it needs to be actually partly led by outside entities. There's a real focus on local, social, economic, and ecological conditions and restoring these conditions to an appropriate place. There's funding to administer the program, and the funding lasts for about 10 years. But it's not a huge amount of funding, and a lot of the funding goes towards actual forest treatments. And there's also a pretty hefty monitoring requirement. So money, as usual, is limiting. Monitoring is required for 15 years, even though the project and funding just lasts for 10 years. So that's just teeing up why our data makes sense for monitoring. These projects have a large footprint across the United States since 2009. If you look at this map and you see the orange outlined areas, those are all CFLRs, and they're distributed across the country, but there are quite a few acres in the West. And so I encourage you to Google this and check it out, because you can interact with this and see where all of these are. A few things that are also worth noting about this program relevant to the monitoring needs. The program is supposed to, quote unquote, leverage local resources with national and private resources. And so by using FIA data, we're really leveraging this national resource. It's also really focused on facilitating the reduction of wildfire negative effects through trying to reestablish appropriate fire regimes. So there's definitely a fire focus, especially in the West, where I'm most familiar. And there's also this requirement to demonstrate to the degree to which these treatments achieve their ecological and economic objectives, which is where the monitoring requirement comes in. So these projects require multi-party, multi-scale monitoring. And like I said, there's 10 years of funding and 15 years of monitoring required. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. These are really place-based groups, and the co-monitoring, the multi-party monitoring, a lot of its impact, at least in my experience, is to help build trust, get people out together, looking at information together, thinking about how they would actually monitor something they care about together. Because sometimes people think they know what they want to see on the landscape, but once you actually have to quantify it, it becomes a lot more, it's a lot more complicated process to come up with a monitoring metric. So this picture shows an example from the Rio Chama CFLR, which I'll briefly touch on, although it's not the focus of this, of people getting together and looking at some initial monitoring results. And you can see a pamphlet with the monitoring results that they're looking at there. Of course, this is all really easier said than done. It's not that easy to get people together and do multi-party monitoring. And there's also a requirement to monitor at both the treatment and project scales, and then also the landscape scales. And after the first several years of the CFLR program, they did some reviews, and one of the big challenges they found was that monitoring at the landscape scale was really difficult. So let's see, next slide. Oh, sorry. So wanted free and available data, which, we have, although we all know it's not actually free. So here's the landscape in which this CFLR sits. This is northern New Mexico in the south, and southern Colorado in the north. And I'm grateful to Ashley's presentation showing Colorado, so you have an idea of where we are. A local group, Mountain Studies Institute, based in Durango, put together this map, and I'm thankful for them sharing it. I know it's a little bit hard to look at, but I'll point some things out. This is a map of all the land management initiatives that involve partners in the area, and there's a huge number of them. There's many million acres represented in this map. These areas all have an interest in monitoring forest conditions, concerns about fire and climate impacts, water, wildlife, and impact on people's well-being and recreation. This area also doesn't have a huge investment in data resources from land management agencies historically, unlike some other areas in the West. So that's just something to keep in mind. And in 2022, 2 CFLRs were funded in this landscape. The Rio Chama, which is that pink boundary that goes into the hatching that you can see there, and then also the Southwest Colorado CFLR. So these had the benefit of learning from the past and hindsight from the other CFLRs, and what monitoring worked and was feasible, was affordable, and what made sense, and also that review that looked at lessons learned from both at the monitoring of the project and landscape scales. So I'm going to focus on some work we've done with the Southwest Colorado CFLR, though it provided a little bit of information also to the Rio Chama CFLR. This is a smaller area, just under 2 million acres. in Southwest Colorado, as the name implies, sort of surrounding the town of Durango, which is a relatively small town, but has a huge recreation economy. You can see here the map of the San Juan National Forest on the left, and then the actual CFLR on the right is in that sort of dotted hatching. They line up pretty closely, but there's private land, other lands in the CFLR, so they're not exactly the same area, but they are quite similar. And also, the Southwest Colorado CFLR was developed with the components from the forest plan in mind. And so that's one reason this made a lot of sense to work on. So just to give you a sense of how awesome this landscape is, this is part of the San Juan National Forest. You can also see some of the major mortality in the spruce here in the high elevations. Just wanted to give you a sense of where we were talking about. So why does FIA's NFI make sense here? Part of the reason is, like I said, there's not a lot of money for monitoring, and there's no other unbiased forest inventory in this area, really. It's not like other areas where there's a lot of standard SAM across the whole landscape. There's also not understory or invasives inventory that's available otherwise, and that is something we actually collect across Rocky Mountain region states. And I realize I'm running a little slow, so I'll speed up. All ownerships are represented, and it's good for providing baseline information at the landscape scale. It's also good for a long-term monitoring need. We don't need to show results immediately, and that works with our long cycle. So like I said, the CFLR has desired conditions that are similar to the forest plan. And so we were able to both monitor for the plan or start to work on monitoring for the plan and the CFLR at the same time. And the collaboration of the CFLR continues to work up what it needs for monitoring, but we knew we had that place to start from. We used the standard FIA assumptions, Green Book assumptions for our estimates, but we did use the Fiesta tool because it allows us to create a custom boundary. So we're able to look at that CFLR footprint. And we also did a lot of work, and Tracy and Nathan did a huge amount of work to work up understory and invasive plants estimates. And that was also something that Fiesta allowed us to do, which is not something that are available in our normal estimation procedures. And we have created some beta reports that are automated from this work. And these are just some screenshots of what those look like below. So here's an example looking at preliminary analysis of the developmental stages of the forest and desired developmental stages. And long story short, most of the percentage of the landscape in these various types is way outside of what the desired conditions would be. Quickly jumping to looking at the understory vegetation, one of the things they're interested in was the percent cover of fescue species in various forest types. And this is a graph from the automated report that spits out. And this belies a huge amount of work that went into this, such as figuring out how to deal with all these different fescue species that were showing up in our database for better or worse, and also working on figuring out how to generate estimates that made the most sense. We also looked at invasive species presence, namely cheatgrass, a few thistles, and common mullein. And these are all graphs from our automated reporting. Here we show the percent cover per acre of these species of interest in the various forest types groups. And with that, I'll wrap up. There's a lot more to do here, figuring out how we might refine metrics as they're needed by the collaborative, and really thinking about what really matters in terms of fire on the landscape. We also need to think about how we analyze trends, considering our low response rates. Our trends are pretty impacted by our stratification. And then also thinking about how we connect from the treatment scale to the landscape scale and how we connect with other products. So with that, we might be thinking about the Rio Chama landscape, which is here. And thank you so much for your time. Sorry for speaking at the end. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Kristen, for wrapping that up. And we'll be rolling right into our next presenter, who is Sara Goeking, the FIA National Program Manager.
Thank you, Katie. So today, tongue-in-cheek, my presentation is when the dog catches the car. I'm going to talk about what happens when you have a goal and you succeed, and suddenly it lands you a large demand for a lot more work. This work started with motivation for identifying knowledge gaps that FIA could fill. So first, the take-home points from my talk, I'm going to start with those. The first one is that FIA data provide quantitative indicators of whitebark pine decline throughout its range, so west-wide in the US, and same for limber pine. Second, FIA's continual data stream offers analysis-ready data for these kinds of broad-scale assessments and ongoing monitoring in the future. Third is that if we engage collaborators early and make sure we're identifying the most useful indicators, we can be sure we're providing the right data. And last, reliance on open data and scalable, reproducible methods will allow us to efficiently meet the need to provide that data and preserve limited capacity in FIA. So I started looking at whitebark pine because it's a focal point for many stressors, including the non-native blister rust fungus, mountain pine beetle, altered fire regimes, and the direct effects of climate shifts. My overarching questions in several different analyses were, are these stressors operating at a scale and severity that warrants broad-scale concern? Sorry, I just realized I am not showing my, I didn't turn my camera off and my Zoom window is, there we go. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so again, trying to answer this question about broad scale stressors. So why would FIA data be a good data source for answering this question? First, it's representative of conditions across the landscape and not just at purposively selected sites. This is very much like what Kristen showed on one of her slides. It provides estimates that are statistically unbiased and precise at broad scales. We have ongoing data collection with published data that's available online and allows estimation of multiple attributes. Last but not least, FIA does a lot of quality assurance and quality control to not only quantify, but also improve data quality. And just briefly, I want to draw your attention to the paper on the right. It's in Forest Science. It came out this past September, and it's an example of how FIA has quantified and recommended improvements for data quality in the RMRS states. This paper was led by Shayla Williams, and the team, I was part of this team, sent samples of trees identified as whitebark pine and limber pine in the area of their range overlap to a lab for genetic analysis and verification. So the results are in this paper. And Shayla and two other co-authors are permanent seasonal crew leaders for FIA, and they did this work during extensions of their normal tours of duty. And none of this work would have happened without the inspiration from Kay Isler, who got me interested in studying whitebark pine about 10 years ago. She was another permanent seasonal crew leader who wanted to look at whitebark pine regeneration during the extension of her season. When she was not able to continue that work, she passed the torch to me, and I hope I've carried it well. So we came up with multiple indicators using FIA data through multiple analyses and papers. The main one that got the most attention was the number of live versus dead trees. And in 2018, we published a paper that found that as of 2016, just over half of all standing whitebark pine trees were dead. That got a lot of attention. We also assessed mortality and growth. And then as we did more analyses, we looked at how they changed over time. We also looked at numbers of seedlings. That was Kay's initial motivation to look at regeneration and including the forest types where it's occurring. So as I said, the number of live versus dead trees got a lot of attention. And FIA data were cited as shown here in the Federal Register in December 2022 in the decision to list whitebark pine as a threatened species. So if our goal was to demonstrate the value of FIA data for temporally and spatially consistent monitoring of a tree species concern, I hope you were convinced. The Fish and Wildlife Service was convinced. And that was a good thing because we want people to use FIA data appropriately. Better information can lead to better management decisions. But it also was a bad thing. It was a challenge because we started getting customized requests from individual national forests and grasslands and even districts for very specialized analyses. Our capacity at that time was already stretched. So in anticipation of growing needs for reliable whitebark pine information at broad scales, I thought about how we could meet that need without pulling staff resources from other mission-critical work. So we came up with 4 guiding principles. The first was relevance. Which attributes and spatial scales are most relevant? Second was reliability and precision. So how small of an area is too small? How many categories are too many? And when do managers just need any number as opposed to having no number? The third was reproducibility, using open science, so open data and code whenever possible, and using online tools. If that wasn't possible, then using internally verified scripts with public data, and as a last resort, using confidential data. The last principle was scalability. So are we able to do this across management units consistently? If we were to conduct custom analyses for each management unit, but also continue to do these broad scale assessments that yielded different numbers than the sum of the finer scale ones, do you think that the public and other managers would recognize the nuanced reasons that might cause discrepancies? Our experience is that they won't. So as with mature and old growth and carbon assessments and other issues of concern, we need to do work that is relevant, reliable, reproducible, and scalable. These are the steps in the strategy that we used to address this need. First was identifying collaborators. So in spring 2023, I started reaching out to contacts at regions 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, all the regions wherein whitebark pine occurs, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a list of common attributes and spatial scales for which we could efficiently generate estimates. Second, we did develop that list. We used eValidator to do most of the work, and actually Kyle Dodson did most of that work. So thank you, Kyle. That was tremendous. We delivered those attributes with standard errors and metadata. And then when some units asked, how can we downscale these to our local vegetation types? Because that's how we're reporting our management actions to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we provided some additional guidance on how they might do that. And then last, as we were getting requests for confidential data across multiple management units for the purpose of developing whitebark pine distribution maps and models, we entered an agreement with an RMRS scientist, Sean Parks, to do one west-wide whitebark pine climatic suitability model and map based strictly on FIA data. Again, then we know the data are of known quality. So here's the list of attributes that we came up with. Area, number of live trees, that was the big one. We learned very quickly that numbers of live trees are the main metric needed for reporting to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Federal managers have to estimate take, used here as a noun. Take is the number of trees within any proposed management area. We still included the other attributes because a lot of silviculturists and ologists found them useful as well. The spatial scales shown here, some were nested within others. And again, there were some units that wanted finer spatial scales. And so we provided a white paper just describing, here's how you might do this. And it involved a crosswalk between FIA forest types and locally relevant vegetation types from their own maps. So I mentioned the confidential data and the climatic suitability map. Every region wanted to have, and still wants to have, a map and a model that is optimized for their region, but that makes it hard to do prioritization in the national whitebark pine strategy across regions. Also, it often involves a lot of different data sets collected at different spatial and temporal intensities. And the reason why this climatic suitability map, this is a little bit different because it's one of the only efforts. There are some other efforts, but this one is making projections into the future based on climate scenarios. So part of the National Whitebark Pine Strategy is to identify blister rust resistant trees, collect cones, propagate seedlings, and plant them in suitable locations. And the suitable locations tomorrow might not be the locations that are suitable today. So, and again, using a consistent probabilistic data set, FIA data, for calibration results in a geographically representative model consistent across all the regions that can support that broad scale strategic prioritization of restoration. So our outcomes, we had some successes. We were able to deliver the data, and we soon will have that west-wide map. Lessons learned is that we need to contact collaborators early and communicate often to ensure we have a common understanding of our needs. I thought that the size class distributions of numbers of trees would be useful, and it turns out they really needed numbers of individuals of any size. That was the main thing for their, at least the initial consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then a big lesson was that the lack of consistent vegetation classifications or even crosswalks between FIA forest types and regional classifications limited the ability to efficiently scale FIA estimates to locally relevant, like project level scales. So back to the take-home points, FIA data proved to be very useful, and this should be repeatable in the future and efficient. We learned engaging the collaborators will tell us if we're providing the right data. And the big point, I think, is that relying on open data and scalable, reproducible methods is a good way to meet growing needs and preserve our limited capacity. So with that, I thank you for your attention and your time today. I'd be happy to take questions if we have time.
And we do have time for a couple of questions. So any questions for Sara?
Oh, that's a quick question. This is Glenn. Hopefully it's coming up.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi. Hi, anyway. What did you learn about managing success?
About managing,
yeah.
about managing success?
Right. Yeah.
We were just that we were able, we considered it a success that we were able to get all these different people from all these different regions. And I want to acknowledge another lesson learned there. At least at the time we started this, there wasn't any national scale coordination of the response to the consultation process for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We basically brought people together across National Forest System regions to come up with this list, and we were able to deliver what they agreed was going to be useful to them.
That's awesome. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I hope that there's more coordination now. I don't know the latest at the NFS level. I know that it's been a scramble to address that consultation process.
Yeah. Oh, that was a great presentation, because I know you think about it, it's like, oh, this is a great idea, but you start thinking, what happens? What are we creating if we do a really good job?
And the dog catches the car, and then you're going 65 miles an hour.
Which is a nice problem to have. But yeah, that was awesome.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Sara. And next up, we have Aaron Kamoske. And Aaron is an ecological analyst with the Forest Service Ecosystem Management Coordination staff.
Hi all, my name is Aaron Kamoske. I'm the ecological analyst for the National Forest System. So before getting started, I just wanted to give a big thank you to everyone at FIA for all the work that they do behind the scenes to produce these data that impact so much of our work. So with that being said, commonly expressed challenges from the field related to monitoring include help asking the right monitoring questions, extracting and analyzing data, and streamlining reporting. To help with these challenges, the Adaptive Management Monitoring and Analysis team is co-producing National Forest System unit-level data evaluations for commonly asked monitoring questions that are answerable with nationally available data sets. FIA data is being used extensively to complete these evaluations related to forest structure, change, and development stage, which helps fulfill the 2012 planning rules monitoring requirements. So this presentation will show how fully automated reports produced with FIA data in the R programming language are developed and used to meet this wide range of needs across the National Forest System. So this flexible process helps to alleviate additional workloads on unit staff and provides national consistency in data and reporting for monitoring, assessments, and project planning. We do this by answering questions related to changes in trends and amounts of young, mature, and old growth forest on the unit, changes in composition, structure, and patterns of forested ecosystems across the unit, as well as the spatial distribution of these attributes using FIA-informed remote sensing products. So the AMA team that I'm part of promotes the use of scientifically substantiated data, which is collected efficiently and transparently to inform all stages of the adaptive management cycle. We provide decision makers and staff with essential information and approaches needed to continue to learn about ecological and socioeconomic resources on National Forest System lands, and to address potential uncertainties when making land management decisions. We work across all parts of the Forest Service, across multiple agencies, and with universities and nonprofit partners to meet these goals. We have a great team and just want to give a big thanks to all of them and our close collaborators and friends. So monitoring really matters because the associated data and information provides insights into the management impacts and allows us to assess the status and trends of important resources. In other words, it gives us invaluable feedback on whether we're meeting our management objectives. Moreover, it's a requirement within the 2012 planning rule to help show the public how the agency is progressing towards desired conditions on the landscape. Monitoring results and information can help to justify a purpose or need for upcoming projects. It can give us a pulse check on work we invest in, and it even allows units to build a case for funding, which we'll show an example of here in a second. In addition to providing feedback for decision making, monitoring helps us be accountable and transparent with our partners and the public. In fact, monitoring information can be a compelling communication tool as it's released to the public every 2 years in the form of a biannual monitoring evaluation report, or BEMER. These reports document status and trends of a wide variety of resources across each National Forest System unit, with FIA being an integral part of several of these analyses. However, we're not currently meeting all of these monitoring requirements across the system for a variety of reasons, such as difficulty in extracting data from databases and a lack of in-house capacity or skills to not only do the analysis, but also to communicate the results. To meet that need, our team's developing automated reporting workflows to deliver information on commonly asked monitoring questions found across all National Forest System units. This entire process, from data polls to analysis to acreage estimates with standard errors to report generation, is part of this single streamlined scripting process in R. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the type of information from FIA that we're providing to NFS units and how it can be better used to understand trends and changes in forest across all Forest Service lands. So what does this all mean with respect to FIA data, and how can it be used? So first, we can use FIA data to make acreage estimates of each forest type on a given national forest. In this example, we're going to show data from the Colville National Forest. Each one of these graphs shows an estimate of acres with a 90% confidence interval on the y-axis, in 2 evaluation periods to compare on the x-axis. In this example, light green represents FIA plots measured between 2002 and 2011, and dark green is plots measured between 2012 and 2021, so two completely separate evaluations. This type of information gives us a quick assessment of the current status and trends of forested lands across the Colville National Forest, which allows us to start to formulate further monitoring questions to explore. So by putting the estimates on the same y-axis, which represents acres by forest type, we can see that the unit is dominated by only a few forest types. In this case, it's Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and western larch. And while there are no significant changes in the total acreage amounts across reporting years, we can dive in a bit further to start to explore other attributes of each forest type. So focusing in on these three forest types, Douglas fir, western larch, and lodgepole pine, we can start to look at specific information to help understand trends within these forests on the Colville National Forest. For example, we can look at the proportion of each forest type in different size stand classes. Of interest, we can see that in 2012 to 2021 reporting cycles, there was an influx of small diameter western larch conditions within the unit. Whereas in the previous reporting period, we didn't see these same kind of conditions, where at least 50% of the stocking is in trees less than 5 inches diameter. They just weren't present across the landscape. So this figure does not tell us why this change occurred across the landscape. It sends us on a pathway to start exploring why that may be occurring. For example, also using FIA data, we can see that our most common forest types are also impacted a lot by disturbances, which may help explain some of the changes we're seeing across the landscape. Here we see large presences of insects and disease activity across the more common forest types, with potentially an increase in defoliation activity and mortality in the later period when compared to the earlier. Moreover, we can see that lodgepole pine and western larch were not impacted by wildfire or tree cutting according to the FIA data in either reporting period. This leads to some interesting questions about what are the implications of these disturbances to management activities or future wildfire behavior. Moreover, it may lead to questions about what are the impacts to some of our less prominent forest types, and should we also be concerned with their trajectories toward desired future conditions as outlined in the forest monitoring plans. So going back to all of the forest types that were sampled across the Colville, the ones we selected may not be our only or main forest types of interest. Instead, we may be interested in less common forest types for specific purposes related to things like ecological integrity, habitat, proposed management actions, mature and old growth forest, or other needs. For example, maybe there's an interest in subalpine fir for one of the reasons mentioned previously. So while this forest type may be harder to monitor due to the lower number of plots and increasing confidence intervals, it also may allow us to concentrate our monitoring efforts only on the places that are truly in need to answer a given question. So when we start to examine these less common forest types, interesting patterns can start to emerge, even if confidence intervals expand for a given estimate. Here we see 3 different plots showing 2 different monitoring periods. So the same 2002 to 2011 on the left side of each plot and 2012 to 2021 on the right side of the plot. Each one of these plots shows the proportion of the forest type, so in this case, the subalpine fir. And from left to right, we can see a plot of stand age with light green showing conditions less than 80 years old and dark green showing conditions between 80 and 200 years old. The middle graph shows the stocking class with all conditions being in medium or fully stocked, light and dark green respectively. And on the right, we see size class distributions showing that all conditions are in the large diameter category, where more than 50% of the stocking is in trees of greater than 5 inches diameter, with more trees over 9 inches than under. For example, here we can see a loss of younger age trees between reporting periods in the figure on the left, and a conversion of fully stocked conditions to medium stocked conditions in the middle figure. However, large diameter size classes still made up all the conditions across the Colville. Moreover, there were no disturbances or management activities reported within FIA for this forest type. So while FIA can tell us, may not be able to tell us exactly why these changes happened, they do show us the trends. And then we can look at other monitoring reports, such as those we're producing for wildfire, insects and disease, and management activities, and FIA-derived spatial information to dive further into reasons why these may be changing. So towards helping to answer these types of questions, we can use mapping products like TreeMap, a remote sensing-based imputation product that relies on FIA, to look at where these forest types are across the landscape. When we zoom into a smaller area on the national forest, we can see how these forest types are distributed, where Douglas fir appears in purple, subalpine fir in pink, lodgepole pine in orange, and western larch in yellow. This spatial information allows us to overlay additional geospatial information that may occur outside the sample plot network. So here we can see the prevalence of insect and disease activity from Forest Health's Aerial Detection Survey program in timber harvest from the FACTS database, in areas that may be helping to drive some of these impacts and changes that we're seeing. This information can help forest managers clue in on the where that these impacts may occur across the landscape, which can lead to on-the-ground monitoring in specific areas that may be deemed of concern. This type of spatial information helps us add the additional why context to the FIA-based trend information to help make a more holistic monitoring report. All of this information makes its way into a fully automated monitoring report using R Markdown that allows us to show our work, give folks an understanding of what was done and why, share locations of where scripts and data live, such as GitHub and the T drive, and give us an opportunity to provide information that can be used for monitoring, assessments, and beyond. So this fully automated process, from data extraction to estimates to figures to report generation, allows us to easily produce these for monitoring multiple common monitoring questions across all NFS units on a regular delivery schedule, with plans for releasing some of this FIA information in the coming year. So in closing, we can see that FIA data can add a lot of value to NFS units in their monitoring process. This fully automated process we developed can help take some of the monitoring burden off of overly taxed NFS units, allowing for more targeted and focused monitoring to occur while meeting the agency's monitoring goals and requirements. So finally, I just want to give a huge thanks to everyone who has helped in this process. And we love working with other people and collaborating. And we really view this as an ongoing project, with this kind of being a version 1. So if you're interested in collaborating, please reach out. We would love to hear from you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Erin. And we do have time probably for one question. So does anybody have a question for Erin? Yes, Sara. Or no, that's not a hand. That's a clapping.
That's the happy hands.
Yeah, also good.
I have a question if nobody else does.
Go for it.
Hey, Erin, this is Sara Ellison. I'm the FI analyst for Alaska, and I was just wondering how these reports, or if they work for Region 10, because a lot of stuff in FIA kind of breaks in Region 10.
Yeah, we're just starting to explore moving outside into Alaska. We run into that with a lot of the other reports that we're doing too, using all the data, as we all know. We work really closely with Katie, so working in Alaska would be something that I would love to talk to you more about and be able to start to think about how we can maybe make some improvements in that process too.
Cool. Yeah, let's connect after this and talk about it. That'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Well, we will move on to the last presentation then. All right, so last presentation is mine, and I'm Katie Renwick. I'm the FIA National Analysis Lead, and I'll be presenting on some land use change analysis that I've been working on. So first, just a little bit about the motivation for this work. Land use change, and deforestation in particular, can be associated with a range of negative environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas emissions, loss of carbon storage capacity, and loss of biodiversity. So for those reasons, land use change is a big area of interest in both of our national and international reporting. The issue has received increased attention lately due to the European Union Deforestation Regulation, or EUDR, which seeks to curb conversion of forest to agriculture. And I'll provide a bit more background on that on the next slide. FIA data is actually a really natural choice for looking at land use change, even though I know land use probably isn't the first thing you think of when you think of FIA plot data. But the key advantage that I want to highlight is the fact that it's field-based, which allows us to look at land use as opposed to land cover. There are a number of different map products that have been created using remote sensing data that can depict changes in land cover over time. But there can be areas that are temporarily devoid of tree cover due to a recent harvest or other disturbance, but that are expected to regenerate and remain within a forested land use. And so those are areas that we would not consider a land use change. Just briefly, the EUDR goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with deforestation and forest degradation. And this regulation is focused entirely on forest conversion to agriculture. So forest conversion to a housing development doesn't matter in this context. And this is because agricultural expansion drives almost 90% of global deforestation, although of course the primary drivers do differ across different countries. The way that the regulation works is by restricting import of 7 commodities that are associated with ag-driven deforestation, including wood and wood products that originate from a parcel of land converted from forest to agriculture after the baseline year of 2020. And part of the compliance mechanism involves a risk assessment that's based in part on the historic rate of deforestation, both at the country scale, which determines the level of documentation that producers must provide, and then potentially at finer spatial scales, like the area from which a mill is sourcing wood. So with that in mind, our goals for this analysis were to estimate the rate of past agriculture-driven deforestation for the US as a whole, examine any regional patterns, estimate the county level risk where possible based on past evidence, and finally, to design a system that makes it easy to update estimates annually as new data become available so that we can monitor change over time. And to accomplish that, there were a couple of challenges that we first needed to overcome. The first was protocol changes and past measurement error. The FIA definitions and sampling protocols do undergo periodic revisions, mostly to provide clarifications and ensure that different field crews can provide consistent and high quality data. But the problem is that this could potentially cause the data to show what looks like land use change when there isn't any real change occurring on the ground. So to avoid that potential issue, we developed an initial data filter designed to focus the analysis on plots where we're confident that the data reflect true change. The next challenge was that because forest conversion to agriculture is pretty rare in the US, the sample of FIA plots showing ag-driven deforestation was really small. And to deal with this, we produced estimates at several different spatial scales, which allowed us to look at the data in more detail where the sample size was large enough. The final challenge was partial plot conversions. And what I mean by that is just that it was very rare to see a plot that started out 100% forest and became 100% agriculture. What we were seeing instead was small amounts of forest conversion at the margins of agricultural fields, so typically just a portion of an FIA plot. And that may have some implications in terms of our estimation techniques. It's not a problem that I've solved, but I wanted to mention it here, and I will come back to it again at the end, just in case anybody in the audience has ideas. So to account for those potential protocol changes or measurement error, we filtered out plots where there wasn't at least one tree at time 1 that was killed or removed by time 2 as part of a silvicultural or land clearing activity. And that filter is particularly relevant in the context of EUDR because the regulation is focused on restricting import of wood products. So a change in land use status without any form of harvest would not affect wood exporters. So this serves to eliminate changes in status that may have occurred due to crew error and protocol changes. And it also eliminates change that was initiated prior to time 1. Land use can be thought of as the landowner intent for a piece of land, and that's something that can be hard to identify in the year following harvest. So just as an example of that, these images are showing the approximate location of an FIA plot and how the landscape has changed over time. This plot was initially part of a pine plantation, so when it was next visited in the year following harvest, it was logical to assume that the area would be replanted and it was still classified as forest. When the plot was next visited, however, there was clear evidence of livestock use, and so half of the plot was then classified as pasture. But in this case, the deforestation event actually occurred prior to time one, so not within the interval that we're using to look at the annual rate of change. We looked at estimates of forest conversion to agriculture across 4 different spatial scales. The national estimates are useful in the context of the EUDR for the country level risk assessment. And at the national scale, it was possible to split agricultural land use into 4 different subcategories. So cropland, pasture, idle farmland, and other agriculture. Looking at the regional estimates allowed us to gain additional insight into spatial patterns of where conversion to these various subcategories is concentrated. And the regional scale was as fine as we could go and still have enough sample size to look at those subcategories. So for the state and county level estimates, we aggregated all of the agricultural land uses, but these estimates still provide additional detail about the spatial patterns. And the county level estimates in particular were of interest because they could help wood producers understand potential risk of past deforestation within the area that they're sourcing from. So let's take a look at the results. Nationally, only 0.04% of forest is being converted to agriculture annually. And like I mentioned, the EUDR doesn't care about forest conversion to other land uses, but I did add in some others for comparison. And we can zoom in on these bars that are too small to even show up on the graph. And what that shows is that for the US, the biggest land use category replacing forests is development. And it's also interesting to note that the amount of forest converted to agriculture is roughly similar to the amount of forest converted to woodland. And forest conversion to woodland is typically a natural transition occurring without human intervention. And it simply indicates that a plot no longer meets the height requirement to be considered forest under the international definition of forest land use, although it would still be considered forest based on the FIA definition. So focusing now on just the area converted from forest to agriculture, what really stands out for me is that about 60% of those acres are being converted to pasture, so more than twice the area that's being converted to cropland. We can look now at the regional patterns, and the first thing to note here is that there's little to no agriculture-driven deforestation in either the Rocky Mountain or Pacific Coast regions. The greatest area of past ag-driven deforestation is in the South. And in fact, we can see that the prevalence of conversion to pasture that was noted at the national level is driven entirely by the South. If you look at the North region, the rate of conversion to pasture and cropland is much more similar. We can also take a look at the state level results to get a bit more detail on where that conversion is occurring. And as expected, the southern states show up here, Texas in particular, and part of that is because Texas has more land area. But we were noticing that the percentage of forest converted to agriculture, and that typically meant pasture, was greater in Texas and Oklahoma. Next, we can take a look at the county level estimates. And the main thing I want to highlight here is that 83% of counties had no evidence of deforestation. And I'm intentionally saying no evidence here because what that really means is that there weren't any FIA plots within the county where we had some evidence of land use change. So it doesn't mean that there wasn't any ag-driven deforestation. I think particularly when we're looking at something like this that's occurring in very small spatial areas, it can be hard to estimate that given the sampling intensity of FIA data. So the other thing we can take a look at is the uncertainty associated with those county level estimates. And I think that's useful to look at in map format because you can see here the darker colors are lower percent error. So those are counties where we might have more confidence in the results. but the percent error overall is pretty high. The lower end of that scale is starting at 51%. So obviously it would be awesome if we could reduce this uncertainty. And so it seems like an area that we might be able to benefit from the use of some model assisted or small area estimation techniques. Like a couple of the other presenters in this session, I did all of this analysis using the Fiesta R package, but I did use the standard post-stratification or green book estimation technique. When I started looking into small area estimation, though, I quickly realized that this was going to be a challenge with these partial plot conversions, because typically those techniques rely on auxiliary data, so a raster, and the raster value is taken from coordinates at plot center. So this image here is showing what is scaled to be a 30-meter raster overlaying a plot. And if we can imagine that this started out mostly forest, except for maybe a small portion in the bottom left, and then a piece of that upper subplot was converted to agriculture, based on a lot of the remote sensing data, this could look like it was forest that stayed forest. So I know there are some other more advanced or newer small area estimation techniques that might be able to get around that challenge, but they haven't yet been operationalized by incorporation into our packages usable by someone like me with limited statistical experience. So still an opportunity for future refinement. The last thing that I wanted to highlight in the context of this session was how the analysis was set up for efficiency. This FIA analysis is part of a larger project where we were looking at a number of different data sources, but all of the work was done in an R coding environment so that it's really easy to download and summarize new data as new data become available. And I've actually done that several times over the past couple months as new state level data or new states of FIA data were released with more recent years. So the code is set up to download and summarize data, analyze the data to look at where deforestation may be occurring, combine results from a bunch of different data sets, and then visualize that data using an R-Shiny dashboard. And so that dashboard is nice in allowing users to be able to zoom in on an area of interest, compare different data sets, and also toggle back and forth between the raw estimates and the percent error, because I think that's really important for helping users understand the limitations of using FIA data to estimate a rare event at the county scale. For something like biomass, like Ashley was showing, you have all of the forested plots in a county to draw from. But for these estimates, there were typically only 1 or 2 FIA plots per county that showed some sort of deforestation. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip the summary and wrap up. We have just 1 minute left, so I think we'll finish there. Thank you so much for all of the presenters as well as all of the attendees. I know that this was a pretty late session for some of you, depending on the time zone, so we really appreciate you sticking with us. Have a good evening, everyone.